The mirror came with the apartment. That was the first thing the landlord said when he handed Sonia Vreeland the keys. Not the square footage, not the building rules, not which neighbor had the loudest dog. The first thing out of his mouth, unprompted, was that the mirror in the master bedroom was not to be removed. It was original to the building, he said. It was too large to fit through the doorway without disassembly, and the frame was too old and too fragile for that kind of handling. It stayed. Sonia looked at him for a moment. She said that was fine. She was 29 years old, recently relocated for a position at a university library, and she had spent the better part of 3 months searching for an apartment in a city where the rent had become a kind of dark humor, the punchline being that people still paid it. The apartment on Carver Street was the first one she could actually afford that didn't smell like a problem she didn't want to identify. The mirror could stay. The mirror could do whatever it wanted. She signed the lease that afternoon. The building was a converted Victorian row house in the older part of the city, subdivided sometime in the 1960s into 4 apartments stacked 2 per floor. Sonia had the rear unit on the 2nd floor, which meant a view of the narrow alley behind the building and the brick wall of the structure behind it, but also meant she could hear considerably less street noise than the front units, which she considered a reasonable trade. The apartment itself was small but well-proportioned. A living area, a kitchen that didn't require apology, a bathroom with original tile that had survived the decades with a kind of stubborn dignity, and a bedroom just large enough to contain a queen bed, a wardrobe, and the mirror. The mirror was on the wall, directly opposite the foot of the bed. It was large, much larger than you'd expect in a residential bedroom, nearly floor to ceiling. Framed in dark wood that had been carved with a repeating pattern of interlocking shapes that Sonia could not quite resolve into anything specific no matter how long she looked at them. Not quite geometric, not quite organic, something in between. She looked at it for a long time the first night, standing in her new bedroom with boxes stacked around her and the overhead light harsh and unflattering, and she thought, that is an unusual thing to leave in a bedroom. Then she made her bed and went to sleep. The first thing she noticed was that her reflection was always a half-second behind. This was not the kind of thing you noticed all at once. It accumulated. She would pass the mirror on her way to the wardrobe in the morning and catch a movement in her peripheral vision that was slightly mistimed. Her reflection still turning when she had already stopped, still raising a hand when she had already lowered hers. She assumed it was a visual artifact, a product of the glass being old and possibly slightly warped, the way antique mirrors sometimes produce a kind of optical irregularity. She mentioned it to her colleague at the library, a compact and cheerful man named Theo, who had an opinion about everything and was usually right about half of it. He said old mirrors did that sometimes. He said something about the silver backing degrading unevenly. He said she should get a new mirror. She said the mirror belonged to the apartment. He gave her a look she filed away and moved on from. The delay worsened over the first 2 weeks. Or rather, and this was a distinction that Sonia, who was precise by nature and profession, kept returning to, she became more aware of it. Whether it was getting worse or she was simply paying more attention, she couldn't determine. The result was the same. She had started to feel watched in her own bedroom, which was a feeling she disliked with a particular intensity of someone who had lived alone for years and was accustomed to solitude as a neutral condition rather than an uncomfortable one. She began avoiding the mirror at night. This was easy enough at first. She simply stopped turning the overhead light on after dark, using instead the small lamp on the nightstand, which cast a warm, narrow light that didn't reach the mirror and left it as a dark rectangle against the wall. Problem managed. She slept fine. She told herself she was being sensible. On the 9th night, she woke at some point in the small hours to find the room lighter than it should have been. The lamp was off. She always turned it off before sleeping. The overhead light was off. The window, which faced the alley, admitted almost no ambient light from outside. The room should have been essentially dark. It wasn't. There was a faint luminescence coming from the mirror. Not bright, nothing dramatic, nothing that would be visible to someone walking past the door, but enough to cast a dim, sourceless light across the foot of the bed, enough to make the room navigable, enough that when Sonia sat up and looked at the mirror, she could see it clearly. She could see herself in it. Her reflection was sitting up too, hands in lap, head level, looking back at her, except Sonia had her hands pressed flat on the mattress behind her, leaning back on them. Her reflection's hands were in its lap. She stared at this for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Her sense of time had compressed into something unreliable. Then she turned on the lamp. In the lamplight, the mirror showed her exactly what it should. A woman in rumpled sleep clothes, sitting up in bed, hands on the mattress behind her, hair disordered, looking across the room with an expression of controlled alarm. The luminescence was gone. She left the lamp on all night. She did what any person trained in research does when confronted with something they don't understand. She looked into the history of the building. The Carver Street property had been constructed in 1891 by a merchant family whose name appeared in the building permits, and then very sparsely afterward in any public record. The house had remained a single-family residence until 1962, when the estate sold it to a property company that converted it to rental units. What happened in the house between 1891 and 1962 was, as far as Sonia could determine from the city archive and the digitized newspaper records accessible through the university library system, essentially undocumented. Essentially, there was one item, a brief notice in a newspaper from 1938, filed under the miscellaneous column of the city section. The kind of small item that the papers used to run when something had happened, but no one was quite sure how to categorize it. It was 4 sentences long. It reported that a resident of the Carver Street address, a woman whose name was printed as Mrs. H. Voss, had been removed to the county hospital following what the paper described, with the careful vagueness of its era, as an episode of acute nervous disturbance. The episode, the notice said, had apparently been precipitated by something Mrs. H. Voss had seen in a mirror. The notice did not specify which mirror. It did not need to. Sonia printed the notice and set it on her kitchen table and looked at it over her coffee the next morning. She was not, she told herself, a superstitious person. She believed in what she could document. She was a librarian. The organization and verification of information was not simply her job, but a mode of thinking she had inhabited for so long it had become indistinguishable from her personality. She documented what she had experienced. She wrote it down in the notes application on her phone, time-stamped, with the same clinical precision she brought to cataloging acquisitions. The reflection delay, duration, and frequency. The luminescence, date and approximate duration. The hand position discrepancy, exact details. Then she added the newspaper item to the notes, cross-referenced with the address. Then she sat there and drank her coffee and thought about what a rational person with a documented pattern of unusual occurrences and a piece of corroborating historical evidence was supposed to do next. She went to work. She came home. She did not look at the mirror. That evening her sister called. Her sister's name was Margot, and she was 3 years older and had the particular quality of older siblings who have witnessed you at your worst and love you anyway, which made her both the best and most dangerous person to confide in. Sonia told her about the mirror. She told her all of it, in order with the time-stamps. Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cover it." Sonia said she had considered that. Margot said stop considering it and do it. Sonia said the frame was too fragile to hammer a nail above it, and she didn't want to put anything adhesive on the wall without checking the lease, and besides, and this was the part she didn't fully articulate even to herself, she wasn't sure covering it would accomplish anything. Whatever it was that the mirror was doing, covering the glass wouldn't change what the mirror was. It would just mean she couldn't see it. Margot said that was the point. She covered it anyway. She used a bedsheet. pinned at the top of the frame with 2 thumbtacks pressed carefully into the wood. It took her 20 minutes to get the sheet to hang evenly. She stood back and looked at the covered mirror, the lumpen white shape of it, the slight weight of the sheet pulling the bottom away from the glass, so that a few inches of the carved frame were still visible at the base. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. She woke at 3:08 in the morning to the sound of the sheet hitting the floor. Both thumbtacks were still in the wood. The sheet was on the floor. There was no draft, no window open, no mechanism by which the sheet should have come down, and the mirror was uncovered. It was faintly luminescent again, and her reflection was standing up. Sonia was lying down. Her reflection was standing at the foot of the bed, inside the mirror, upright, hands at its sides, looking at her with an expression she could not read because the light was too dim and the distance was too great, and because some part of her, the oldest and most self-preserving part, did not want to look directly at it. She turned on the lamp. The mirror showed her lying in bed. Just that. She did not sleep again that night. She sat up against the headboard with the lamp on and her phone in her hand, and she watched the mirror until the room began to lighten with morning, and the mirror showed her nothing but herself, awake and rigid and waiting. She called the landlord in the morning. She told him she wanted to discuss the mirror. He said he was available Thursday. She said she meant now. He said he could be there by noon. He arrived at 12:15. He was a man in his late 60s, deliberate in his movements, with the particular wariness of a person who has managed rental properties for decades and has learned to approach tenant complaints the way you approach a dog you aren't sure of, carefully and without sudden movements. She showed him the mirror. She told him what had happened. He looked at the mirror for a long time. He looked at the thumbtack still in the frame. He looked at the sheet on the floor. He said, "This has happened before." Sonia said she knew. He said, "You looked it up." She said, "I'm a librarian." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the edge of her bed, uninvited, but she let it go, and he looked at his hands and said he had managed this building for 22 years, and he had rented this unit to 11 different tenants in that time. He said most of them left within a year. He said 2 of them had specifically mentioned the mirror. He said one of them, a young man, an architecture student, had lasted 3 weeks and had left without asking for security deposit back, which in 22 years of property management was the clearest signal a tenant could send. She asked what happened to him. The landlord said he didn't know. He said the student had simply stopped returning calls and the apartment had been empty when he came to check. He said, "I should have told you." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want to break the lease?" She thought about it for a long time, long enough that the landlord shifted his weight on the edge of the bed, long enough that the quality of the light in the room changed slightly as clouds moved outside. She said, "Not yet." What she did instead was research. She had access, through the university, to archives that were not publicly available, estate records, probate filings, the digitized personal papers of families who had donated their documents to the historical collection. She spent 3 evenings going through everything attached to the Carver Street address and the family that had built the house. The merchant family had a name, Aldrin. They had built the house for the parents and occupied it across 3 generations. The last family member to live there was a woman named Clara Aldrin, who had inherited the property in 1921 following the death of her mother, and had lived there alone until her own death in 1959, at which point the estate had passed to distant relatives who had no interest in maintaining it and had sold it promptly to the property company. Clara Aldrin had never married. She had worked as a portrait painter, modestly successful, known in local artistic circles in the 1920s and 1930s. She had exhibited occasionally. She had corresponded with other artists. She had, by all documentary evidence, lived a quiet and solitary life in the house on Carver Street for nearly 4 decades. She had also, according to a letter in the archive, a letter written by a friend and fellow painter, addressed to a third party, discussing Clara with a fond but slightly worried tone of someone describing a person they are not sure how to help, developed what the letter called an absorbing preoccupation with mirrors. The letter was dated in 1947. It said that Clara had begun to believe that mirrors did not show the present. It said she had told her friend that mirrors showed a version of the moment that was slightly offset from reality. Not a reflection, she had said, but a recording, a persistence. The glass remembered what it had seen, she had said, and what it showed you was never quite now. The letter said Clara had covered every mirror in the house except one. It said she had spent the last years of her life in conversation with that mirror. It did not say what the mirror had said back. Sonia read the letter 4 times. Then she went home and stood in her bedroom doorway and looked at the mirror. The room was lit by the afternoon light coming through the alley window. Gray, indirect, the light of a city that kept the sky at a distance. The mirror reflected the room back precisely. The bed, the wardrobe, the boxes she still hadn't fully unpacked. Herself, standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame. She thought about Clara Aldrin, alone in this house for 38 years, talking to a mirror. She thought about what a person would have to believe or discover to do that. She thought about the reflection that had stood at the foot of her bed. She thought about the faces it might have been made from. How many reflections a mirror accumulated in 130 years of continuous use. How many people had stood where she was standing, had sat where she now slept, had looked at themselves in this glass and seen themselves looking back, and had left something behind without knowing it, an impression, a residue, the specific and unrepeatable shape of a person, recorded in silver and time. She thought about what Clara had said, not a reflection, a recording. She thought about what the mirror might have learned across all those decades, about the people who stood in front of it, what patterns it had absorbed, what it had, over time, assembled from all of that watching. She thought about how long it had been doing this. She thought about the fact that it was watching her right now. Her reflection in the mirror raised its hand. Sonia had not moved. She called Margot that night and said she was moving out. Margot said finally. She said she needed to do it quickly, within the week. Margot said she would come help. She said she would bring her truck, and they would do it in a day. Sonia said there was one thing she needed to figure out first. She was standing in the bedroom doorway again, phone to her ear, not looking at the mirror. She was looking at the wall beside the mirror, at the carved wooden frame, at the interlocking pattern she had never been able to resolve into anything specific. She had looked at it again that afternoon in the good light, with the reading glasses she usually only used for fine print. She had looked at it for a long time. The pattern was faces, not obvious, not cartoonish, not crude, stylized to the point of abstraction, worked into the interlocking shapes, so that you could look at the frame for days without seeing it. But once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Face after face after face, interlocked, each one slightly different, each one with its eyes oriented toward the center of the frame, toward the glass. Dozens of them, maybe more. She hadn't counted. She stood in the doorway and told Margot she would explain later, and said good night and ended the call. She looked at the mirror. Her reflection looked back. Then, slowly, with the patience of something that has been waiting far longer than any single life, her reflection smiled. Sonia's face was still. The reflection held the smile for a long moment. Then it did something she had no category for, something that took the bottom out of her completely. It raised one hand and pressed it flat against the inside of the glass, as though asking to be let out. She was on Margot's couch by Thursday. She did not go back to the apartment. She arranged, through the landlord, who accepted her call with the resignation of a man who had been expecting it, to have a moving company collect her belongings. She specified in writing that the mirror was not to be touched, not covered, not moved, not handled in any way. The moving company sent 2 men. They were in and out in 4 hours. They reported nothing unusual. The apartment sat empty. The landlord listed it again 6 weeks later. He described it as a quiet rear unit with original architectural details. He mentioned the square footage, the original tile, the proximity to the university. He did not mention the mirror. He told himself he would say something when the time was right. He told himself the new tenant deserved to know. He told himself this every time, with every new lease. And the time was never right. And the lease always got signed. And the mirror was always there when they moved in, on the wall directly opposite the foot of the bed. Its carved frame full of watching faces, and its glass full of everything it had ever seen. Waiting, remembering, learning. The apartment on Carver Street was rented again in the spring. The new tenant was a graduate student in art history, which the landlord found quietly appropriate. She said the mirror was beautiful. She said she had never seen anything like it.
If you have a strange experience or a story you can't explain, leave it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Until the next video, stay safe.